I'm Dr. Rick Johnson, and I'm going to give us the second part of Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. Again, I have a book out called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and I've been studying sugar for over 20 years, and we talked in part one about how sugar, and in particular fructose, can activate a biologic switch that makes us become fat and diabetic. Today we're going to talk about other foods that can activate this switch, and it's not just sugar that can do it. So in part one, we told the story about how normally animals regulate their weight beautifully, and so if they eat too much on one day, they'll eat less the next, and they maintain their weight usually in a very tight, regulated level. But some animals will actually purposefully gain weight, and they'll do this at certain times of the year. For example, the bear will activate a switch, a biologic switch, where it suddenly no longer regulates its food intake very well. It becomes incredibly hungry and starts to eat like a huge amount of food and can gain 8 to 10 pounds a day. And this is because they've lost control of their appetite, and you can show this by evaluating them for a hormone called leptin. Normally the leptin works by telling you, when to quit eating, that you're full, and these animals become resistant to the effects of leptin, and so they become hungry and they eat a lot, gain weight, gain fat. They become insulin resistant, and they get all the features of metabolic syndrome. And then when they hibernate, they will quit eating, and they'll live off their fat for 4 to 5 months. And so, there is this switch, and the question is what activates that switch? And we talked about what drives the development of obesity in bears, and we came to the conclusion that it was very likely fructose. And fructose is the primary sugar in fruit, but it's also a major sugar that's in, fructose is present in table sugar, which is sucrose. It's present in a sweetener called high fructose corn syrup. And so it's also present in all these added sugars like table sugar that we put in our foods. And it seems to be the biologic switch in bears. They eat huge amounts of fruit, not like we do. And so when you eat a huge amount, you get a large dose of fructose. And we found in part one that this that fructose was unique in that it tends to produce uric acid inside the cell, which then acts on the energy factories to reduce the production of ATP. And this leads to an alarm signal in the cell that there's not enough energy, and the food that it stimulates food intake. But what it does is there's a shunt to move most of that food and most of those calories into stored energy, fat, as opposed to usable energy, which is that ATP. So here is the actual pathway. What fructose does is it consumes energy when it's being metabolized. And there's a caloric pathway where it's used to produce energy, but there's also a energy depletion pathway, which is a side chain reaction shown here, where the fructose generates a substance called uric acid, and that uric acid then goes to the energy factories, where it suppresses the energy production by those mitochondria, and in turn, instead of energy being produced, energy is stored in the form of fat. And so this keeps the energy levels in the cell, the ATP levels low, which keeps the whole machine going to tell you to keep eating and to keep putting on, trying to gain more weight, because it tends to shunt the energy to fat as opposed to the energy we need to do what we want. When this happens, the drop in energy in the cell activates an alarm signal, and then that alarm signal causes a foraging response. You start getting hungry and searching for food. It stimulates fat production while at the same time blocks fat burning. It creates insulin resistance, which we talked about in the first lecture as that it has a benefit in survival because it tends to raise glucose in our blood that our brain can use, which doesn't require as much insulin as other tissues. And so it tends to get more than its share of glucose, which is good when you're trying to survive. And then it stimulates a little bit of inflammation, raises blood pressure, and all these things which are very helpful in survival. We also talked about in the first lecture how there was a mutation that occurred in humans millions of years ago. It was actually in the ancestors to both apes and humans. This mutation affected uric acid levels. And normally there's an enzyme called uricase that degrades uric acid. And so when you eat sugar or fructose, the uric acid you make, part of it is broken down by this enzyme. But in humans, we lost that enzyme through a mutation. It's shown in the red X. And as a result, our uric acid goes up higher and faster in response to sugar. And we tried to understand why this mutation occurred. And we found evidence that when this mutation occurred, that our ancestors were actually starving, that there was global cooling, there was not enough fruit available, especially during the cooler seasons like the equivalent of the winter, and that this mutation allowed the few fruits available to stimulate more fat production, which could allow the animals to survive the winter, and so more could survive. And so it was a survival factor when we had this mutation. However, as mentioned, fructose is also in sugar. And so what happened was in the very beginning when we were eating fruit mainly from, or fructose mainly from fruit, this mutation actually kind of protected us against starvation. But in today's society, it's actually doing the reverse. And the reason is it's actually increasing our risk for obesity. And the reason is because we're eating so much sugar. We've gone from eating about 4 pounds of sugar a year in 1700 to about 150 pounds of sugar and high fructose corn syrup per year as of today. And again, the problem is not fruits. Fruits are healthy. They have small amounts of fructose. The problems are the sweets and the pastries and the soft drinks where there's a huge amount of sugar and high fructose corn syrup. And this has led to a dramatic increase in the risk of obesity and diabetes. And today, 12 to 15% of the population is diabetic. Obesity is increasing to about 1 in 3 adults. It's being seen in children. It's a real problem. And that's where we ended with lecture 1. But is it just sugar that drives obesity? Many people know that obesity does not always just occur in animals being given fructose. For example, the penguin can get really fat when it nests, and it's not eating fruit. There's no fruit in that and the Antarctic. And we also know that things like potatoes, and especially things like French fries, which are, starch, which is really glucose, and then it's got salt and oils and stuff. Admittedly, ketchup has sugar, but I think everyone understands that salted, French fries are not necessarily a good thing. So how is it that obesity occurs in animals not eating fructose, or why is it that French fries are fattening? And it turns out there's a big trick. And the trick is that it's not just the fructose we eat, but it's also the fructose we make that is the problem of what's driving obesity. And there is a way the body can make fructose. And it makes fructose from glucose, another carb. Remember, glucose is the main carbohydrate in our blood. It's present in things like potatoes and rice. It's in starch. And glucose, when you eat it, it can be converted to fructose. And it's through a pathway called the polyol pathway that converts the glucose first to sorbitol and then to fructose. And we call this the polyol pathway. It was known to be activated in people with diabetes because when glucose levels are high, that sort of stimulates the production of fructose. And that's what happens in diabetes. The glucose levels are high in the blood, and it kind of makes the blood sticky and thick, increases the concentration of glucose, and so it tends to cause the osmolarity of the blood to go up, and that triggers the stimulation of this polyol pathway. So high glucose levels kind of feed this pathway, and the glucose, some of that glucose gets converted to fructose. So we knew that was true in diabetes. But would animals like to make fructose if there's no fructose to eat? And if they wanted to gain fat to survive, for sure they would want to be able to make fructose if they couldn't find it. So it's sort of interesting that certain foods actually can produce fructose. And the big one, the one that, the big monster in the hallway are high glycemic foods. Because high glycemic foods raise the glucose in the liver and the blood, sort of like diabetes, only it's transient. So when you eat like a potato or you eat, rice, the starch in the rice breaks down to release glucose, and it can release it very rapidly. And so the glucose levels can go up in the blood. We call this high glycemic foods. And these high glycemic foods, when they happen, that glucose goes up, and it should trigger that production of fructose. So to look at this, we decided to give glucose to animals, and we put glucose in their drinking water. The animals loved it, and they started to make fructose, as shown on this left panel. When they were given glucose, and they're not eating any fructose, now they're making fructose. And when they make fructose, that seems to have a role in stimulating obesity and fat accumulation and insulin resistance and fatty liver. And the way we could show that is by giving glucose to animals that cannot metabolize fructose. And these animals that can't metabolize fructose, we call them fructokinase knockout, because fructokinase is the enzyme that metabolizes fructose. And when you block that enzyme, now the animals, they still get a little fat, perhaps because of the effects of insulin to help stimulate fat. They get a little bit more insulin resistant, and they get a tiny bit of fatty liver, but we really have a very major effect on blocking the metabolic syndrome. So it turns out that a lot of the way carbs cause metabolic syndrome is through the production of fructose. So fructose is more important than just being in sugar and high fructose corn syrup. Fructose is made from high glycemic carbs like rice, potatoes, bread, cereal, chips. And these 5 types of foods are really some of your major ways to stimulate obesity, along with sugar. And so now we understand the low-carb diet a little bit more. When you go on a low-carb diet, you're reducing your ability to get fructose, but you're also reducing your ability to make fructose. And that is why the low-carb diet is so powerful. Yes, a little bit is also from removing the effects of insulin, but we did a study with soft drinks, which have glucose and fructose, and if we block fructose metabolism, we block the effects of soft drinks to cause obesity completely. So it turns out that it isn't so much the stimulation of insulin that's the problem. It's the production of fructose. But the production of fructose is driven by high glycemic carbs, and it is driven by sugar. And this is why you, watching this low carb, being part of this low carb program, you can understand how beneficial it is to be on a low carb diet. Well, are there other ways to get fat besides carbs? Well, the answer to that question comes from a very interesting line of research that we did related to this biologic switch. So we became interested in, how animals conserve water because, when you hibernate, you're not eating or drinking. And so you need to be able to store water, right? Because otherwise you're going to run out of water while you're hibernating as well. And, in the desert, how do animals conserve water? Well, it turns out, like if you're a camel, the first thing you do is when you find some water, you drink a huge amount. And these animals can drink a huge amount. They also sweat less than most animals. They lose less water through their lungs because they have a special nostril. They can concentrate their urine. They are like professionals at learning how to hold on to water. But what does a camel do when all those tricks have run out? What do? Well, they have a hump on their back, and that hump is fat. And what's really interesting is that the hump can be used to produce water. It's like a canteen. And the way it works is the hump doesn't contain water, but it contains fat. But when the animal's desperate, it will burn the fat to produce water because you can make water from fat. And it's about 1-to-1. In fact, whales produce water from their fat. A lot of their water comes from their fat because they don't drink seawater. So that means that fat has another purpose. It isn't just a source of energy. It's also a source of water. So just as starvation activates this biologic switch, could dehydration be another mechanism to activate this switch? So the idea here is that if an animal gets dehydrated, the salt concentrations in its blood will go up because it will lose water. And that's called an increase in serum osmolality. And in turn, that could activate this polyol pathway to make fructose. It would also stimulate this hormone vasopressin. This is a very important hormone in dehydration because it causes the kidney to concentrate and to reabsorb a lot of water, so that the result is that the urine gets really small in volume, concentrated, and stinky. And so dehydration could stimulate, the animal try to hold on water. And one way it would do is to reduce the water loss through the urine. But the other way it might do it is to stimulate fat production as a means to create a source of metabolic water. So can dehydration stimulate the production of fructose? Well, the trouble with dehydration is that no one really wants to get dehydrated as a means to gain fat, because dehydration is kind of an unpleasant state. So it would be kind of better to not have to get diarrhea or things like that as a way to stimulate the switch. So is there a better way to make fructose? Well, there might be. And you probably noticed that a lot of animals love salt licks, and they'll find them and they'll lick the salt, which will increase the salt concentration in their blood. And so it creates dehydration, but without losing water. So you don't lose water like you would with diarrhea or vomiting, but instead you're still making yourself dehydrated, so you're thirsty and you want to drink more water. But this is a way to gain water, not really to prevent the loss of water. And so if that could stimulate the production of fructose, this might be an ingenious way to increase your fat stores to protect you from dehydration. And there's some data that salt licks can help an animal gain weight. So is there evidence that people who are overweight are dehydrated? Well, guess what? Most obese people are dehydrated. And if you look here on the right side of the slide, you'll see that, that people who are dehydrated, that people who are obese are 12-fold more likely to be dehydrated based upon some types of testing. And if you measure the salt concentration in their blood, they're about 2.5-fold more likely to be dehydrated. So dehydration is really common in people who are overweight and obese. And not only that, most people who are overweight or obese are on high salt diets, which could be a means for causing this type of dehydration. And what's more, high salt diets also predict the development of obesity and diabetes, just like high sugar diets do. So these two white powders, salt and sugar, are both linked with obesity. And, all the emphasis has been on sugar, but salt also is associated with obesity. And in fact, we mentioned that vasopressin is the dehydration hormone. Well, if you measure vasopressin levels in the blood, they are high in people who are overweight and obese. And they also predict the development of obesity and diabetes. Like in this slide, you can see that they measured vasopressin levels in people. And this was by quartile. So quartile 4 is the highest levels of vasopressin. And when you have that high levels of vasopressin, you have a very increased risk for developing diabetes. So it's not good to be dehydrated. Well, can we show this? Can we prove this? So we took animals and we put salt in their water so we could enforce that we would increase the salt concentrations in their blood. And when we did that, initially the animals looked fine. They didn't gain weight. We didn't really know what to say. But after a few months, whoa, they started to gain weight big time. And they became fat and they became diabetic. And when we looked in their livers, the livers were high in fructose, even though they weren't eating fructose. And we looked at food consumption, and they were eating a lot more. And they were becoming this resistant to leptin that I mentioned earlier in my talk. And so they couldn't control their appetite. And they kept eating and gaining weight and becoming diabetic. So we decided to give this salt, and I should mention that when we gave the salt in the water to encourage them to drink the salt, we put a little bit of sucralose, an artificial sugar, in the water, and so the control group had artificial sugar in their water. So they're both getting the same amount of artificial sugar, but it just to create a little bit of sweetness so that the animals would drink a lot of salt water. And shown here is weight gain, and weight gain was prevented in the animals that were on a high salt diet if we blocked the metabolism of fructose. So the reason these animals became overweight and obese was because they were making fructose. Because if we blocked the fructose metabolism, they controlled their food intake, they didn't gain weight, and they were protected from obesity. Not only that, it wasn't just their weight that was protected. They didn't become diabetic. And listen to this, salt has long been linked with high blood pressure. Animals on a high salt diet will raise their blood pressure over time. And these animals, they could eat the same amount of salt, but if they didn't metabolize fructose, their blood pressure didn't go up. They didn't get thickening of their heart as much. It was much less. And so even blood pressure is driven by this conversion of glucose to fructose. So the way salt works is to stimulate fructose production. And that's what drives hypertension and the metabolic syndrome. These animals on salt also got fatty liver, which you can see here, and it's called the wild type mouse on salt. All those little white vacuoles you see in the upper right corner of the histology, that is all fat, and it was blocked in the animals that couldn't metabolize fructose. And you could measure that as the liver fat or triglycerides, and the liver function tests were high in the high salt diet and were blocked when metabolism was blocked. Well, salt intake has gone up quite a bit in the last century, mainly from the intake of processed foods. And so we're eating more salt just like we're eating more sugar. And today, many people are eating 10 or 12 grams of salt a day. And that salt is often in processed foods. As shown here, you can see how salt content varies depending on whether the food is prepared in a processed way. So if you go to a restaurant, oftentimes there's a lot of salt added to foods. And if you cook that same food at home, the salt content is much, much less. And so we looked at this. We thought, well, could salt intake actually then be another mechanism for driving obesity? And so we knew that in Japan there's a lot of salt intake, and we looked at how much salt was being ingested. And yes, if you're eating over 10 grams of salt, you had a much higher, or over 11 grams, you had a much higher risk for developing diabetes, fatty liver, and things like that compared to those who didn't. And we also looked at salt intake and salt concentration, because the way the polyol pathway is activated, it's not by the amount of salt, it's by increasing the salt concentration in the blood, and then that triggers the production of fructose. And so that meant to me that maybe it's the concentration of salt in the blood that's more important than the amount of salt we eat. And as shown here, when we look at salt concentration or sodium concentration in the blood, gosh, if your serum sodium is like over 145, you're really at a very significant risk for developing hypertension and fatty liver and problems like that. Whereas if you just look at salt intake versus salt concentration, there is an effect of salt intake shown on the right, but it's nothing like salt concentration. Basically, if you have a high salt concentration, you're at increased risk for developing disease. And a high salt concentration is driven by two things. It's driven by how much salt you eat, but it's also driven by how little water you drink. Because if you drink very little water, that will also raise the salt concentration in your blood. And that suggests that maybe we've been off for years telling people to reduce their salt intake, when what we should be doing is talking about the balance of salt intake and water. We should be telling people to reduce your salt intake, but drink more water. To look at that, what we did is Mehmet Kambi, a collaborator, friend of mine from Turkey, decided to do a study where he gave soup to people. In soup, you can mask the amount of salt. So he gave a fair amount of salt in the soup to volunteers, and some of them were randomized to get water with it. So they're all getting the same amount of salt, but some are drinking a little bit of water, some are drinking no water, and some are drinking a lot of water. And what we found is that when they just had the salty soup, the salt concentration went up in their blood, their serum sodium. It triggered that dehydration hormone, vasopressin, raised the blood pressure, and activated the switch. But if they got water, we could block that rise in serum sodium, and that blocked the vasopressin response and the rise in blood pressure. In other words, it's not just the salt, it's the amount of salt and the amount of water. If you drink a lot of water, you can block the effects of the salt. So what we know is that salt intake helps generate water. And the way it does it is it increases the serum osmolality, activates the polyol pathway, and stimulates vasopressin. The vasopressin works on the kidney to concentrate the urine and reduce water loss. And the salt acts on the polyol pathway to make fructose, which then makes fat, which becomes another source of water. So, very interesting. Well, you've got these two major pathways. You've got this polyol pathway, you've got this vasopressin pathway. Both are interested in trying to conserve water. But vasopressin, could those two pathways be more connected than we think? And could fructose maybe have a role in stimulating vasopressin itself? To look at that, we actually took laboratory rats and we deprived them of water for 24 hours so that they became dehydrated. And they started making vasopressin. And when we looked in the brain, we found that, yes, this dehydration made the serum osmolality go up, and that stimulated the production of fructose in the brain in the same place where vasopressin was made. And here's the exciting thing. When we blocked the metabolism of fructose, we blocked the stimulation of vasopressin. So vasopressin is actually controlled by fructose. Fructose is a much more important system than we had thought. When the body makes fructose, it's there to help make fat and water. And the way it does it is it stimulates vasopressin to help hold on to water in the kidney, and it also stimulates the production of fat as another source of water. And in fact, when you give soft drinks to people, you can show that it stimulates vasopressin. Fructose actually stimulates vasopressin in humans as well as in animals, and it's associated with the study here is actually in animals, but if you give fructose, you can increase their body weight, you increase their vasopressin levels, and so fructose becomes a way to help conserve water and fat, and it does so by making fat as well as stimulating vasopressin to concentrate the urine. So here's the million-dollar question. Could vasopressin have a role in stimulating fat as another way to store water? And you know, in the desert where animals get dehydrated very commonly, they often have very high vasopressin levels. So they will often have fat in their tails and things like that to provide a source of water. So could the vasopressin also have a role in fat formation? Well, we know that vasopressin doesn't just work on the kidneys. Like if you're a frog, vasopressin helps prevent water loss through the skin. And there's also vasopressin may have a role in blocking water loss and water vapor from the lungs. And vasopressin also lowers body temperature, and that would be a way of preventing or reducing water loss as well. So, could vasopressin be involved in driving obesity? So vasopressin binds several different receptors, so it works through very complicated ways. And one way is it works on a receptor in the kidney to make you hold on to water, so it concentrates the urine. But there is a kind of a receptor that no one really understood what it did. It's called the V1b receptor, and its role in human disease is not well understood. But when we blocked the V1b receptor, the vasopressin 1b receptor, we found that blocked the effects of fructose to cause fat. And sugar and fructose cause fat through this receptor because when you block it, the animals still have sugar. They eat a lot of sugar, but they control their chow intake. They don't gain weight. They don't get diabetic. They don't get fatty liver. They are protected. And so what we've shown is that salt and sugar both cause obesity, that dehydration and high salt intake increases fructose, and just like soft drinks and sugar contain fructose, and high glycemic carbs make fructose. And then the fructose stimulates vasopressin, which stimulates the production of fat as well as concentrates the urine. Well, we're getting new insights into what causes obesity. And if dehydration is part of the mechanism for driving obesity and people are dehydrated, that really raises the question we might be able to block, prevent, or reverse obesity by drinking water. Is there any evidence for that? So what we did is we took animals and we gave them high fructose corn syrup in their drinking water. Ooh, they loved it, and they started drinking a lot of it, and they started getting fat. So even though they were getting water, they were also getting a lot of sugar, and they were getting fat. You could show their body weight increasing, their body fat increasing. They became more and more insulin resistant. So we wanted to give these guys additional water, and the way we did it was we put water in the chow, and we did it by creating a thing called a hydrogel, where the food is kind of impregnated with some water. And they actually loved this food, so they continued to eat a lot of food with this water, but they were getting a higher water intake. And what happened was suddenly the body weight started to level, even though they're getting sugar, high fructose corn syrup. Their body fat starts to level out as well, and their insulin resistance reversed. They were protected from diabetes just by giving water. Now, you've probably seen a lot of people running around with water bottles. There's kind of this general myth that drinking a lot of water can protect against obesity, but there's not really been a lot of science behind it. But guess what? There is a science now. We now know that dehydration drives fructose production and drives obesity. And when you drink water, you can suppress this. Now, remember that although water is good, you can drink too much. You can become intoxicated with water. So the adage, the frequent saying, drink 6 to 8 glasses of water a day, that's a good number. don't drink huge amounts because you could get into trouble. And if you're running marathons or doing things like heavy exertion, just drink to thirst, because that's a condition where you can hold on to water a little too easily. And likewise, following surgery, or if you've got a heart condition. So, discuss with your doctor. But in general, it seems like drinking 6 to 8 glasses of water a day is very, very protective. All right. So what about, is there other foods that can cause obesity? What about foods that raise uric acid, since uric acid is part of that pathway by which fructose causes obesity? Well, there is a fifth taste. There's sweet. We just learned that sweet kind of encourages you to eat sugar, and we like it. Salt, that's a taste in the tongue that encourages us to eat salty foods, and we like it, and it helps drive obesity. And there's 2 tastes that are bitter and sour. They kind of tell us not to eat certain foods. But there's another taste that we like, and that's this umami taste. And umami is a flavor, we call it the savory flavor. It really tastes good. It's why Caesar salads taste good. It's why gravies taste good. And basically, it is a receptor for glutamate, which is an amino acid, and also for 2 nucleotides, AMP and IMP. And these are breakdown products of ATP. And so glutamate, AMP, and IMP are what drive that umami flavor. They're in gravies, they are in beef and yeast extracts, they are released from foods that have been dried, aged, or cured. And the main sources are beer, because of the brewer's yeast, as well as organ meats that are rich in these purine-type foods that contain these nucleotides, and shellfish, blue cheese, some Asian foods. And it's often added to processed foods. Things like MSG is monosodium glutamate. And so that's an umami flavor, and they add it to chips and stuff like that to enhance the flavor, but it's really an umami. So it turns out that umami foods directly raise uric acid. And the way they do it is the glutamate can be broken down to AMP, and IMP is also another part of this umami foods. And look at this fructose pathway. Look at it. Here it is. And that energy depletion pathway is AMP and IMP. So when you're eating this stuff, you're actually feeding this pathway. And then you get the uric acid, you get the effects on mitochondria, you get that vasopressin stimulation, and you get obesity. So umami foods could be another way to cause obesity, but has that really been looked at? Well, not very well. So what we did is, Miguel and Aspa and I decided to do some studies where we gave MSG to animals in their drinking water, and when we did that, as we increased the concentration, the mice love the MSG, they're drinking a lot of it, they're increasing their food intake from it, they make more uric acid, and there's that energy level, ATP levels go down, fat stores go up, you got it. It's activating the biologic switch. And so then what we did is we gave the MSG with or without IMP and AMP, because it's been reported that the IMP and AMP really enhance the effects of MSG. And when we add the IMP and MSG together, boom, the body weight goes way up. They're eating a lot more. Their fat weight goes up. It's the pink dots here. And they become diabetic, and they get fatty liver. Oh my God, umami is another cause of obesity, and it does it by bypassing the fructose pathway and entering right in there in the uric acid. And in fact, you can even make an animal obese by putting uric acid in the drinking water. And when we put uric acid in the drinking water with MSG, the animals gained weight, they become fat, they gained liver weight and became fatty liver. And but remember that uricase enzyme that broke uric acid down to allantoin? So if we substitute allantoin, it doesn't work. It's the uric acid that's driving obesity. All right, well, glutamate levels, they can vary a lot. And especially in China, some people are eating huge amounts of glutamate, like 10 or 12 grams a day, compared to the normal intake, which is like 1 to 2 grams a day. And you can see that the confers an increased risk for obesity. But an important point here, they're only eating, even the maximum is not very much glutamate a day, 6-7 grams actually. And so they're not eating like what we're doing with sugar. So although glutamate is more potent on a gram for gram basis, we're eating 75 grams of sugar a day, but we're only eating like 2 grams of glutamate a day. So the umami pathway is not so important in driving obesity. It is a little bit, things like a beer, which has the brewer's yeast. The beer belly is there for a purpose. I mean, it's the reason that the reason you get a beer belly is because you are making fructose from the beer, and it's raising the fats in your blood, and it's causing fatty liver and all those things. All right, so we now have another way to activate the switch. Umami foods, along with sugar, high glycemic foods, and salty foods. And now we have a kind of a bothersome finding that obesity is driven by the foods we tend to like. So while fructose in the diet can activate the fat switch and cause obesity, we now know high glycemic carbs do, salty foods do, and umami foods. Now I have to tell you that the low carb diet is a blessing because it's not only is it removing sugar and high glycemic carbs, but the way salt works is to convert glucose to fructose. So if you're on a low carb diet, you don't make as much fructose either. And so, or from salt. So low carb diet protects you against all these causes except for perhaps umami foods, which as we mentioned is not so powerful. And it also tells us why all these tastes we develop, like sweet, salt, and umami, why they develop, because nature wanted us to be able to keep our sufficient fat stores. And so it helped us by searching out for foods that would help us store fat. So I want to end my lecture 2 with special thanks to Dr. Lanaspa, Roncal, and Sanchez-Lozada, as well as all the many collaborators I've had. Nature does want us to be fat. And in part 3, we'll talk about how this pathway turns out to be more important than just in obesity and diabetes, and that it has important effects on cancer and dementia and other things. So thank you very much. We'll now proceed to part 3.